Thank you, everyone, for being here, especially with the threat of weather. If you haven't been here, you are sitting in the sala at El Zaguán, the home of the Historic Santa Fe Foundation. And I'm Pete Warzel, the executive director here. About 5 years ago, literally just after I started here as a foundling, this very genteel man showed up with a slight Irish accent and started talking about DNS. And also in the context of DNS, he was talking about a guy named Ernie O'Malley, who hung out with DNS and her coterie of artists here at El Zaguán and in Mexico in the 1930s. DNS is Dorothy Newkirk Stewart, the artist and sister of Margareta Dietrich, who purchased El Zaguán and expanded it, including a studio across the way for Dorothy Stewart. Ernie O'Malley was an IRA commander and a poet and an intellectual. The guy I met 5 years ago was Cormac O'Malley, who is Ernie O'Malley's son, and moved to the U.S. with his mother after the death of his father when he was 14. Cormac attended Harvard, Columbia Law School, and is retired from a career in international and corporate law. He focuses on Irish history and culture, his father's legacy and archives and art collection. He's been the president of the board of advisors at Gluckman Ireland House at the Center for Irish and Irish American Studies at NYU. He's also published several of his father's books, edited and published a memoir that he found of his father, edited notes, interviews, a series of interviews from the Irish Civil War, and curated an exhibition of his mother's sculpture work, Helen Hooker. Let me quote from Ernie O'Malley from The Singing Flame. "We who had been beaten in the fight, who had withstood the jail war, parted to take up the threads of inscrutable destiny, some to begin life over again." And that's really what Cormac's here to speak to us about today, essentially. The life begun over again. And he's speaking in a place that Ernie gave lectures to Dorothy and Margareta's friends and associates probably over 90 years now. It's a pleasure to welcome Cormac O'Malley to the Historic Santa Fe Foundation.
Pete, thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here. Today the story is really about two people who deserve their own hour-long presentation. So we're sort of collapsing two people into one lecture, but it's really about how Dorothy Stewart and Ernie O'Malley met, and in my father's, and I'm delighted to have my sister here, who happens to be living in Santa Fe now, Eitan O'Malley. But this became his home in Taos and Santa Fe, and in that milieu, I'll show how he would have met Dorothy Stewart, and he then drove Dorothy Stewart as an artist who wanted to go to Mexico, along with another friend, Theodora Goddard, and they tootled off to Mexico for 9 months. as one could in those days. And I was just reading my father's diaries in preparation for today, and I noticed that in 1931 he was writing in Mexico that there had been a new law just passed by the then president, who was very, new president of the United States, who had brought in an immigration law and was announcing that unless you registered by something like January 30th of 1931, it would have been very difficult to get back into the United States. And indeed, as history records, father gave all his documents to Dorothy on the way back, and he swam across the river and met her on the other side. So there was no wall in those days, and things were a little bit more lax. But that was just an amusing incident as to how he got around. Anyway, so look, today is really telling the story of Dorothy, and occasionally on these slides you'll have this DNS characterization. I think I've gotten rid of most of the DNS and the EOM, because that's the way I often refer to both of them. They're both characters, they deserve their own presentations. I'll just give an overview on Dorothy here, on my father, and then on their travels in New Mexico and then in Mexico, and talk about something afterwards. Dorothy was a Philadelphia family. It's either 4 or 5 daughters from the distinguished Stewart family. Well-to-do people, probably living in the Bryn Mawr area or somewhere along the main line. And she had, early on in life, she had some medical issues, and the parents found out that art was a way to relieve her. She stopped talking, but she started drawing, and sort of drawing was a way that she could show her emotions. Another problem for her was that her father died when she was only 14, and so all 4 sisters had lost their father. But the mother was a strong lady. One of the things she did with Dorothy was, who was having educational problems in the school system, etc. She took her out and traveled around the world, and say they had a sufficient wherewithal at the time in terms of the family, so they could do that. She came back and she studied her art at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and came out to, for whatever reason, I think in my research, I found that Dorothy had stopped by Santa Fe in about 1921, and so happens her sister, whose husband had been military governor of Montana, I believe, he died, and Margaret Dietrich came to Santa Fe in 1925. In fact, bought the property, as Pete said, on the corner house, and that property is the Juan Jose Prada house built in 1786, and then continued to buy property. You know, things were happening in the Spanish American community, sort of revivalism. She was quite well to do, and so she had money, and went back into the preservation of Spanish American as well as Mexican American. And so she bought the corner house, and she bought this property from the Johnson family, and continued to expand it. And made this into a residence for artists, and subsequently this has been expanded. But that was the purpose way back then. And she built a studio for her sister so that she could do her art, and that's on the other side of this property. She became quite a distinguished painter in those days, known for her print work. Later on, she did printed books, and we have her younger sister's great-grandniece with us, Elizabeth Berry Sebastini, who has many of the works of her grand aunt, as well as the printing press on which some of the materials were printed. And I left out in the lobby some of Dorothy's prints that she had given to my father back in 1931, when she had asked my father to write the book for her art. and so he took the text, and they went to Ireland. They lived in the damp house that we had in Ireland for many years. I didn't open them until some years ago because they were wrapped up in a piece of paper that didn't look like anything. And suddenly I discovered them, and here they were, Dorothy Stewart's prints, printed on the press, which Elizabeth has back in the 1930s. So this is an extraordinary, to me, sort of a providential coming together of many aspects in my life. So the other great character of the Stewart family is Margareta, who she's usually known as, yes, I got the spelling wrong, sorry about that, Margareta Dietrich with a C-H. And she was born in Philadelphia, married, a great suffragette, founded out in Montana in 1906, and she was president of the Montana Suffragette Committee, went on to national committees, and she brought all of that energy to Santa Fe when she came here. And again, with the passing of her husband, I presume there was some wherewithal, and so she devoted herself for the rest of her life. She died, I think, in about 1961, so she survived her artist sister. She bought that Pozobrada house, and as you heard, expanded it. So back to Dorothy. Father was in Taos, New Mexico, doing his thing, and I'll move on to him shortly. But they met here in the 1930s, and I sort of conjecture that Theodora Goddard was a New York artist who fairly strong socialist feelings, and when there was an opportunity and she met Dorothy and Ernie, and they talked about Mexico. Mexico was a place where anyone who was sort of liberal and progressive wanted to see what was going on. And what was going on? There had been a revolution, and there had been a whole new artistic community had been established. And they were wondering, how has the indigenous art been included into their modern art? And in their post-revolution, they had sort of overthrown the prior century of art, had been essentially a continuation of Spanish art. And what the new revolution had done was incorporate indigenous art. And so using some of the great painters of the time who had done murals and come to the United States, they wanted to go down and see. And my father's diaries are full of the descriptions of the art that he had seen in Mexico. Anyway, he was sort of hired as a driver to go down with the two ladies, and they set off on December 30 and traveled around Mexico for about 9 months. And then came back. She came back here, continued her work. She went back to Mexico several times. And just today I saw some of her work that she'd done from 1928 through 1944. And so she loved Mexico. She met Mario Chalot down there in 1935, who became sort of a companion of hers. She kept in touch with my father, and I found